Continuing with question 96, Article 3, kind of the natural next step after Article 2. Article 2 was about whether human law can prohibit all vices. Article 3 is whether human law can prescribe all acts of virtue. And he basically says that, well, all virtue is for the good. It's good for us, right? And it could be good for the whole community, that is the common good, or it could be for the good of an individual, like helping out a friend, for instance. That's the example that he gives. So human law can prescribe all virtues, but that doesn't mean it prescribes every single act of virtue. So it can prescribe acts of virtue insofar as they contribute to the common good, but that doesn't include all acts of virtue. So human law can't make you or prescribe you, force you to help your friend move. That is an act of generosity and an act of friendship, but it can't prescribe that. But there are, generally speaking, it can prescribe all virtues. For example, justice. Human law can mandate that you pay just wages, right? You can't do otherwise. You can't enslave or have indentured servants. And again, not to say that human law has made mistakes in the past, but human law, this is within the domain of human law. It can mandate that you pay certain wages. Likewise with see something, say something. We kind of see it everywhere now, especially in like airports and train stations. But an example I was thinking of this was with the Boston bombing a number of years ago. One of the bombers, the younger one who was in college, he messaged his college friends while he was on the lam, and they didn't say anything. They knew that he was involved, and they did nothing. They went to prison for that. They were convicted of aiding and abetting, a terrorist. And so, having the courage to say something is a virtue that human law can prescribe. And again, not all acts of virtue, of fortitude or courage. It can't make you, or mandate that you dive into traffic to save a child, but that's a good thing to do. But there are certain acts of fortitude that it can say, no, you have to do this. So see something, say something. And if you fail to do that, it can be a crime in some cases. And the last one, I put CPS. Human law can't make you parent a certain way, but it can mandate that you don't neglect your child. It is a crime if you are a negligent parent, even to animals, right? If you have pets and they're not treated well, that is a crime. You're being, cruel and unusual to animals, but especially to children. If you're neglecting your child, that's not okay, and that is within the purview of human law. So again, not all acts of prudence or justice or courage, but certainly some of them, insofar as they contribute to the common good. Article 4 touches on whether all human laws are binding on our conscience. And the answer is pretty simple, but I do like that he kind of goes into more detail. He says that just laws are in fact binding, and unjust laws are not binding, right? Going back to what Augustine says, that an unjust law is not a law at all. But again, that creates some ambiguity. Well, what makes a law just or unjust? Perhaps we could say simply that a just law is one that's in accordance with reason. But again, that kind of determination is hard to make because we're kind of left to our own devices. We're left to our own ability to reason what is just and what is not just. Which is why, the Israelites had it easy. They didn't have to think about things. God just told them directly, here's what you should do. There you go. And zero work had to be done on their part. If they just follow those laws blindly, they know they are just laws because they're coming from the fountainhead of justice and reason. And following those laws they know it's safe. Whereas when it comes to human law, we can't always trust ourselves to make good laws, and there's a long history of people making really bad laws. And so we do still need to kind of question laws to make sure that they are just and not encouraging bad behavior. But I do like that he kind of breaks down some tools to help us identify what an unjust law might be. He says that a law can be unjust in two ways, and the two ways are just whether it's contrary to human good or contrary to divine good. And he gives kind of like the several arenas where it can be contrary to human good with respect to our end. And again, our end is, happiness, beatitude, ultimately. So for instance, if there was a law forbidding you to go to church, well, going to church is, part of, order towards my end of beatitude, of happiness. And so that would be an unjust law. Other laws that are burdensome laws, right? Again, we kind of gave this example before. If it was mandated that you had to pick up all litter that you walked by and made it a crime to walk by a piece of trash that you didn't pick up, that would be just too burdensome. And it's just not really within reason to expect that kind of law. And he gives several other arenas, whether they're towards the individual, the ruler, etc. He goes further to say that these kinds of laws are not only are they non-laws, they are acts of violence. And that's a pretty bold statement, and kind of worth meditating on and thinking about for a bit, that an unjust law isn't just a bad law. It is an act of violence. We should very much avoid that, because essentially to not be just is to be violent. And that is a very stark dichotomy, and one we should take very seriously. And anyways, and then the other way that it can be unjust is whether it's contrary to divine good. And he does kind of give some guidelines as to these. For ones that are contrary to human good, in some cases, you can obey them, to avoid scandal or spoiling your cause. But, obey them to an extent, right? I think of St. John Paul II, who, when German Nazis invaded Poland, made it illegal to study for the priesthood. And at this time, he was trying to go into seminary. So a bishop was teaching him privately, secretly, in the bishop's home. I think that bishop was later found out and martyred because he was forming young priests. So again, obey to an extent. Okay, so you're not going to the seminary, but because it's an unjust law, it wasn't wrong for John Paul II to continue his education. So they obeyed it to an extent. They weren't studying publicly, because that would just be stupid. And they, he did break the law. He did take his studies and was clandestine about it. When it's contrary to the divine good, however, those kinds of laws are not to be obeyed at all. I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, where they were, Israelites. I think they were Jews at that point. Anyways, and they were mandated to worship this pagan god. And anyone who didn't was to be executed. And anyway, so the gong goes off or whatever, and it's time for everyone to worship this false god. And these three men said, no, thank you. And they refused. And as a result, Nebuchadnezzar threw them into, the oven where they were expected to burn to death. But again, this was a law that was contrary to divine good. I am the Lord your God. There's no other God besides me. And they saw that to worship this false god is not something to do to kind of keep the status quo. This is something to be outright refused. And they refused to obey it. And, well, he tried to kill them. But if you know the story, they were thrown into the fire and they did not burn. In fact, when they looked in, they saw a fourth person in there with them. And people speculate about whether, it was some kind of angel or maybe it was Christ himself. Anyways, and then when they came out, they weren't burned at all. The only thing was that their clothes smelled like smoke, which is really remarkable. And Nebuchadnezzar was like, "Oh snap! Clearly, your God is someone to be reckoned with." Anyways, great story. So laws that are contrary to human good, you can obey them to an extent, to avoid scandal or kind of keep things peaceable. But when it's contrary to a divine good, these are not to be obeyed at all. All right, and I think that's good for these two articles. We'll move on to the next two. Continuing with question 96 on the power of human law. In Article 5, the primary question is whether everyone is subject to the law. And obviously he's going to make more and more distinctions. So he starts off saying that one is subject to the law in two different ways. And these are the two ways, as regulated to the regulator or coerced to the coercer. And we'll kind of elaborate on what those two mean. So regulated to the regulator, basically from a subject of a community to the ruler of that community. And this is specifically as someone who is kind of obedient to the law, right? If you're a law-abiding citizen, you are subject to the law in this way. You are regulated and you are obeying the laws of the regulator. Now, in this case, there are two ways where you are not necessarily subject to the law. Isla wants to come in. The first is if you are not subject to that particular regulator, namely if you're from another country. All right, so that makes sense. You may not be expected to obey, the normal laws for citizens if you're not a citizen of that country. Or another example would be you could be prohibited from certain actions, right? So if you are not an American citizen, you can't vote, for instance. The second way is if you're not subject. You're not subject if you're subscribing to some higher law. So for this, I think of two examples. One we've talked about before with that of Antigone. Creon made that unjust law that her brother Polynices should not be buried because he fought against him. And Antigone buried him regardless. And that is because she was subscribing to a higher law, the law of the gods. And which is another way of saying she was subscribing to natural law. He made a law that wasn't good, and so she was acting under a higher authority, a higher law. I also think of St. Thomas More, who, when King Henry VIII asked him, hey, grant my bill of divorce to my first wife because I want to get remarried because she's not giving me any male children. And St. Thomas More was like, I can't do that. And anyway, King Henry VIII got really upset, threw a tantrum, threw him in jail, and then ultimately executed him. And St. Thomas More's final words before he was executed was, I die as the king's servant, but God's first. Right? As a lawyer, it was his job to uphold the law. He was asked to do something that was contrary to God's law. And therefore, he was sentenced to death by the regulator. Anyway, and then the second way that one is subject to the law is from coerced to coercer. And that is kind of the one who's not obedient. So if you're obeying the speed limit, you're under the law in this first way. You are regulated by the law. But if you are not obeying the speed limit, then you have to kind of be coerced into obeying the law. And that can come in the form of getting a speeding ticket or something of that sort. So everyone should hope to be in this category. We should strive to form our will and our conscience in accordance with the law so that we don't have to deal with the stick. Anyway, so those are the two basic ways that one is subject to the law, and it really just has to do whether we are in accordance with the law, whether we see the law as good and we're obedient to it, and if we're not, then well, there's going to be consequences. The last article for this question, Article 6, was, how was it articulated? Oh, if someone is in accordance with the law, do they always have to obey the letter of the law? And obviously, the rule of reason prevails. And that's exactly what Aquinas says, essentially. He talks about how laws are framed for what happens for the most part, what happens most frequently. And so he gives kind of this longer example of, like, say there's a city under siege. For the most part, if your city's being attacked, you don't open the gates. Duh. But if a situation arose where, citizens of that city are running towards the closed gate saying, open up so we can come in, yeah, open the gate. Like, you wouldn't just be like, nope. There's a law that says never open the gate under siege. So clearly that is, an exception to the rule. You're not going to obey the letter of the law, otherwise you're going to be killing your own people. Another example is if a doctor, gets an emergency call in the middle of the night and he has to get to the ER to do an emergency surgery. He's probably not going to obey speed limits at such an hour. And there are times, actually, my father has been pulled over a few times because he was, pushing 110 miles per hour on the freeway, trying to get to the hospital so that someone didn't die. And at least on one occasion, he was pulled over and immediately jumped out of the car, held up his, doctor's badge and said, I need to get to the ER. And the police officer did not give him a ticket because that would be stupid. Instead, the police officer was like, oh, I'll escort you. And so he pulled in front and he kind of, made the way clear for him. So for the most part, what happens most frequently is cars should, obey the speed limit. But obviously there are situations where the letter of the law is actually hazardous to the people that are under that law. Now he does throw in this last caution that, this being said, not everyone in a community is competent in discerning what is good for the state. In other words, not everyone is competent in determining when I'm an exception to the rule, when it's okay for me to break the letter of the law. That is not really for us to decide as a common citizen. There may be times when we as individuals do need to make that executive decision, but for the most part, that's really not our place. That should really be more in people who have more authority over the state to determine when we should break from the letter of the law, right? So that's it for question 96.